Good morning in Paris. Good afternoon in Paris.
Yes, it's 8 o'clock in Paris.
Oh, good evening in Paris.
Good evening.
Bonsoir.
Good evening to everybody. Hi.
Do we have
Bernie,
anybody?
I don't see anybody else
Good morning
signing
in California.
California, good. Me too.
Hey, Bernie, I don't see anybody else signing in. If they do sign in, I'll let them in, okay? I'll look for that.
Okay.
Why don't you start and yeah, we'll get going now, okay?
Well, welcome everybody to virtual Gombin number 3. And we're delighted to have Karina von Tippelskirch give a presentation today about the famous Gombin Yiddish poet Rajzel Zychlinski. I'll take just a minute. I'm Bernie Geyer. I'm the current president of the Gombin Society. Anyone who wants the job, send me an email. But it's nice to see everybody, so many people online. I think more will join us. I just want to make one quick announcement. We have already scheduled the next virtual Gombin number 4. And I see Michael Shade on this call. He will be talking about the his famous Frankenstein family from Gombin and their 200-year history that he has been researching. So it'll be a great, and the date will be about a month from now, February 28th. And again, I'll make a pitch for any of you who are enjoying this series. Please help support the Gombin Society, renew your membership. Donations are always welcome. There are costs associated with doing these virtual Gombins, but it seems to be something that has brought us together in ways that we were not seeing each other for such a long time over the course of the COVID pandemic. So it's wonderful to see everybody, and I'm very delighted, and I'm glad to have our family, our Masterbaum family from Paris on the call, and I hope there's somebody from Israel here. Oh, and Canada, and we have a guest today. I'll introduce Rabbi Jeff Bassick from Baltimore, who is the rabbi of Kol Halev, the religious community that we belonged to when we were living in Baltimore. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Scott Harris, member of the Gombin Society and from the family of Rajzel Zychlinski, is going to introduce the speaker and run the program. So thank you, Scott. Thank you for your willingness to do this. Thanks to Steve Prosperi for helping with all the logistics, and Vicky Fingerroot. And why don't we begin the day? Go ahead. I'll put myself on mute.
Great, thanks, Bernie. So I'm Scott Harris. Thanks for the introduction, Bernie. I have everybody on mute, whether you've chosen to be on mute or not, except for Karina. That's just to prevent background noise when we do the recording. And I'll repeat this when Karina finishes, but I will unmute everybody. But I'm going to ask that if you take your cursor and move it to the bottom of the Zoom screen, you will see a number of logos. And one in the lower right is reactions. It's a smiley face with a plus sign. If you click that, it says raise hand. And if you click that, I will be able to see that you have a question, right? Now we can try just asking questions, but recognize that multiple people may go at the same time. So we'll have to see how it goes, but let's try that. Or if you like, about 3 logos in, there's a chat function. And if you hit that, you can start typing and say question, or I have a question. Well, let's see how it goes. I'm going to leave it all open, but if it gets to be too much traffic, we'll go to kind of a one-on-one, okay? And it gives me great pleasure, even greater than great pleasure, to introduce Karina. Dr. Karina von Tippelskirch is an associate professor of German and German program coordinator for languages, literature, and linguistics at Syracuse University. Her fields of interest include 20th century and contemporary German literature and culture, translation, transnational literary and cultural movements. Her research areas are German exile literature, German, Jewish, and Yiddish literature and culture, Her publications include books and articles in Rajzel Zychlinski, whose poems she also translated and who is the focus of today's presentation, as well as other 20th century European poets. Her current research and book is on the American journalist Dorothy Thompson, who befriended and ultimately helped to rescue many German and Austrian writers and intellectuals from Nazi-occupied Europe, and she's promised to get me a copy, since I'm a big Dorothy Thompson fan. So with that, I want to introduce Karina. Karina is going to be speaking about the poems of Rajzel Zychlinski. I should note that she gave this presentation in person in New York in November of 2018, and this represents a repeat performance for the benefit of those who could not hear it. And we are video recording this presentation so it can be kept in the Gombin Society archives for future reference and enjoyment. So with that, I'm proud to introduce Dr. Karina von Tippelskirch. Karina?
Thank you. First, let me share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Scott and Bernie, for the re-invitation, for having me here again. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Scott, it was 2019. Could that be? We'll check that later.
Yes, it was 2019. I'm corrected. Thank you.
Yes, I thought, was it that long ago? Yes. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here today and for having me to speak about Rajzel Zychlinski. And I will basically most of the time repeat what I did in 2019, thinking that poetry lends itself to be read again, to be heard again. And it won't be a problem to have different poems again. Maybe it's even a benefit. You've heard what I'm working about, mostly German Jewish writer and German writers who fled into exile from Nazi Germany. I wrote my dissertation on Rajzel Zychlinski in the 90s. That's also when we met. And I've completed actually and published the book on Dorothy Thompson in 2018, but I'm going to write a new biography, her first biography in German in the next 2 years. And if you wonder what all these writers have in common, they all had to go into exile. Even Thompson was pushed out of Germany in 1934, the first American and foreign correspondent who had to leave Germany, ordered by Hitler directly. So they had these experiences in common. They also had in common their resistance to Nazis, to fascism, and they all were writers. When I speak today about your renowned fellow Gombiner, the late Yiddish poet Rajzel Zychlinski, then I want you to know that I had the great privilege to meet her during the time when I was writing my dissertation, but at the same time was also translating her poetry into German. And I will speak about this a little bit later and maybe also during the question and answer. When I embarked on writing my dissertation, it had the title Also das Alphabet vergessen. In Yiddish, this would be a line from her poetry, Efter vergessen dem Aleph Beis. In English, so should I forget the alphabet? I wanted to understand how Eastern European Jews and Yiddish writers responded to displacement and also to the Holocaust. By shedding light on those who were marginalized and whose lives, careers, communities were harmed or destroyed in the years 1933 to 1945, I hope not just to build new knowledge, but also to contribute to a more just and a more peaceful world. Let's see. Here we go. This is Rajzel in 1995, when we met, as we often did, on the boardwalk in Brighton Beach. Rajzel Zychlinski is widely recognized as one of the great modernist Yiddish poets. She's also known as an eminent Holocaust poet, but she did, of course, not set out as such. You do not choose to become a Holocaust poet. This fate was pushed upon her. The first 2 volumes, however, of her poetry were published before the outbreak of World War II. Lieder, poems, in 1936, and Der Regen singt, The Rain Sings, in 1939, in Warsaw. In the following remarks, I want to draw widely on Rajzel Zychlinski's own words to bring her voice to you. It is a poetic voice that was formed in Gombin, informed by the imagery of the shtetl. In his introduction to her first book, published by the Yiddish Pen Club, the eminent Yiddish poet and critic Itzhak Manger registered her poetic requisites: the mother, the cat, the willow, the cloud, the poplar, the beggar, the child, the well. And here's one example of her early poetry. I will read it first in Yiddish and then you will hear it in English. It is called Mame. Mame, du hast gemacht. I'm sorry, I will start over again. Mame, du hast a Feier gemacht, hast von darre Stücklich Holz zerblasen a Sonn. Du hörst wie meine Haarschäubern, a Dank, a Dank. Nur in Dreußen weint noch als der Wind. Nehm ihm, Mame, in der Schürz rein und wieg ihm ein. Der Wind, wird dir gläuben und wie ein Schäpsel zumachen, die Augen. The translation here is from Sheve Zucker, one of the best Yiddish teachers you can have in the world. She translated it as Mama, you made fire. Thin sticks of wood you fanned into a sun. You hear my hair rustling, a thank you, thank you. But outside, the wind is still wailing. Take the wind, mother, into your apron and rock him to sleep. The wind will trust you and like a little lamp will close his eyes. While Zychlinski's early poems evoke the quotidian, they appear often timeless, making no reference to specific events or even places. If they mention a time, it is the recurring seasons and months. Oktober. In Oktober werden Menschen stiller und gepresst. Schwerer wird das Wasser, breiter wird der Krug. Es trinkt sein Schatten aus, der alte Bäum. Der Brunnen schleppt in der Tiefenisch arob mich und dich, zeitiger Träum. October. In October, people speak softly and low. The water is heavier, the pitcher larger. The old tree drinks up its shadow. The well draws us into its depths, me and you, ripe dream. Zychlinski uses simple everyday images, and yet her poems are far from simplistic. From the very beginning, they possess great poetic depths. And Munger points out that their strength is not only in the images themselves, but in their nuance. That's what Scott also mentioned, and they are really rich in nuances. Often they elude the logical, they echo surrealist paintings that Zychlinski saw at that time, and poetry from surrealism. At times, they appear outright paradoxical, often they are dreamlike. Throughout her life, the poet was a vivid dreamer. Here we see her in the woods of Gombin in 1934. But I would also like to point out that she was not only a dreamer, but as you can see, she dressed up for this walk in the woods. And she told me at that time she would often go there and also meet a fellow aspiring young poet from Gombin. She did not say his name. Growing up in Gombin did not mean a restriction to provincialism. She was an avid and well-informed reader, and reading was a door to the world beyond the shtetl. In her poetry, Zychlinski makes references to Chinese writers and French symbolism, to German poets and music, to Rilke and Beethoven and Else Lasker-Schüler, and of course to other Yiddish writers, Eastern European and American modernists. A recurring theme in her early poems is the longing to escape from the narrow boundaries of the home, much as the beggars and vagabonds whom she sees passing through Gombin, through the shtetl, on their way to other places. Her gaze is often set on an undetermined point in the distance, as it is here in this photo, or it is directed inward. It comes as no surprise that Zychlinski won the approval of American Yiddish introspectivists and the founders of the literary journal In Sich, Aaron Glantz-Leles, Yankel Gladstein, and Nahum Baruch Minkoff. Her second volume of poetry, Der Regen singt, The Rain Sings, contains a number of poems that respond to biblical stories, and they always respond from the perspective of women. And that is an interesting side note that in one of our conversations, Zychlinski said that she read for the first time in a library in Warsaw the Tanakh. Although her mother was deeply religious and came from a family with a long line of well-known and recognized rabbis, she, like other women, had not studied the Bible, but grew up reading Trinnes, the prayer books for women in Yiddish. Zychlinski's biblical poems take the readers to the desert. They look at the endless sand through Hagar's tear-filled eyes. When Jacob is with the pregnant Leah and he longs and calls for Rachel, we can feel the bitterness in Leah's tightly closed lips. Zychlinski's feminism, however, does not condemn. It is compassionate. It is giving the old stories new meaning. But the period of Yiddish modernism, with its experimentation, innovation, and the pushing of boundaries, soon came, as you all know, to its abrupt and tragic end. Within weeks of the book's publication, the rich and lively culture and literary world to which Zychlinski belonged would be attacked and soon destroyed. Its writers and readers persecuted, murdered, or uprooted, scattered all over the world. In addition to the lives cut short, there are other losses to mourn, among others, the careers that never materialized or were destroyed, like that of Zychlinski, an aspiring young poet, admired and already recognized, playful, experimental, and bold, engaged with modernist poetry and art from many countries. In the first letter that the poet wrote to me in January 1991, she enclosed a handwritten autobiography, a summary of her life and writing, and I thought it is better to read her words than to tell you about her. She writes, born in Gombin, Poland, daughter of Mordechai and Deborah Appel, sister Hannah, brothers Yankev, David, my brother Abram lives in Paris. Attended a Polish public school from 1916 to 1923. There was not a high school in the small town Gombin. I, together with another student, had a private teacher after the ending of the public school from 1924 to 1927. Father was a leather worker. He went 3 times to the United States. His family stays in Poland. He died in Chicago in 1928. Literary debut in the Volkszeitung in 1927 or 26, a daily Jewish newspaper in Warsaw. Actually, I found her first poem in 1925 in the Volkszeitung. Meleravich had there 1 column each week under the name Letters to One and to All. Yiddish beginners sent there their poems, and Ravitch answered either to continue writing or, and I quote, to break all the pens in the house. So you had to be bold to write to him, and it is certainly not the way of criticism we see and give today to aspiring writers. I also went and sent a few poems, and his answer in that paper was very encouraging. I conducted an orphanage 1 year from 1934 to 1935. I didn't have a special education for the job, but the president of the orphanage in Wrocławek read some of my poems and in some magazines, so he offered me the job. My first book of poems, Lieder, was published by the Pen in Warsaw, the Yiddish Pen Club, in 1936, introduction by Itzik Manger. I was not a teacher in Warsaw. I worked as a clerk in a bank until the outbreak of the war in 1939. About 6 weeks after the German army invaded the city, I was asked by S. Lastik if I wanted to leave Warsaw with him and 2 other people in a taxi, which would take us to the river Bug. The river at that time was the border between Poland and Russia. The price for a place in the taxi was 400 Polish zloty, which was like today $400. I agreed to it and was left almost with nothing. The next day we left Warsaw and the taxi brought us to the river. A man with a boat took us across the river to the other side, and there were Russian soldiers. That was not far from the city Bialystok, and so I escaped from the gas chambers. I lived in Kazan. My son Marek Kantor was born there on February 15, 1943. He is teaching math in universities, including 1 year in the University of Tel Aviv. My husband, Isaac Kantor, was a doctor, a psychiatrist, and worked in Russia, there in a hospital. He died this year, 1990. After I graduated from a high school in New York, I studied in the City College, English Literature and Biology. My name as a student was Rajzel Kantor. In the New School for Social Research, I studied literature and philosophy. And all she added was a list of her books. Many of you probably know that the new school of social research is also the school where many of the exiles that I mentioned in the introduction went to and taught. So they might have crossed their paths. Before Rajzel and her family left Poland for Paris in 1948, she published a third and her last book in Poland. I mean, the last book that she published in Poland. It came out in Łódź. Its title, Zu lautere Breggen, To Bright Shores, is a signal of hope. Its poems, however, are filled with almost unspeakable pain. This is, I'm sorry, I missed to give you this slide. It shows her handwriting from which I was reading. This is the title page, and it says Rajzel Zychlinski Zu lautere Breggen. As you can see, it came out in 1948. This is the book's dedication, and it reads, Im heiligen Andenk von mein Mame Dwoire, mein Schwester Chane, mein Brüder Jankev und David und sehre Kinder, mein Mames Einiglach, Kedoshim von Chelmner und Treblinka. To the holy memory of my mother Dwoire, my sister Chane, my brothers Jankev and David and their children, my mother's grandchildren, victims of Chelmner and Treblinka. And I will read to you the first 3 poems. It says, I want to walk here once more, dedicated to the 3,030 holy victims in my home village, Gombin, who died in the gas chambers of Chelmner in Poland in April 1942. I want to walk here once more on the grass and weep for the sky and for the wind that howls before my face. I want once again to measure the calamity on this piece of ground where once was my home. The door is gone, and my mother, she will not come home anymore, covered with snow, with a blue pitcher of milk in her hand, and with a blue dawn in her eyes. The windows are gone. The sun will no longer wander from wall to wall, from corner to corner, and conjure up for me a green cat on a chair. Only the willows at the river are here. My tears fall into the water, and for a while disturbs their calm. Yellow leaves fall, fall. A tale wanders around on the roads, a tale about people herded together on a field. A spring rain was falling. 3,000 Jews without water, without bread. 4 long spring days. Little children were crying under the stars. They wanted to eat. The surrounding forest did not grow darker from the children's crying. Here they are, the green forests, the forests of Gombin. The deep blue sky did not send fire down from the heights. Cows are grazing in the fields. A shepherd roasts potatoes in the smoke. For what am I still looking here in the village? I encounter the pockmarked Stasha. She lives. She strolls around with soldiers. She's drunk and unwashed. Who calls me here in the field? Who still knows me here? My name? A thorn bush burns in the field. A child cries from the flames. I take off my shoes and approach the little son of my neighbor. His little hands are charcoal, but his eyes are open. I am leaving you, city. Your roads are blue as in the past. You will continue to celebrate autumns, fairs, and the river will flow in the valley. The flight eastwards across the river Bug to the Soviet Union had saved her and her husband's life. Their son Marek was born there during the war, as you heard, in 1943. They were spared the organized murder and destruction that the German occupiers brought to their hometowns and all of Eastern Europe. But the destruction of Gombin, the murder of Rajzel's family and her people, would haunt her all her life. In one of her letters, Rajzel wrote that she, I quote, left Poland because I didn't want to live there, a land soaked with Jewish blood and ashes. She and her husband Itzhak and their son Marek left Poland in 1948, first for Paris, where her brother Avrum lived and had survived the Holocaust. And in 1951, the family immigrated to the United States, where they settled in New York. The poems she wrote in America are reflections of the trauma and the losses she experienced and expressed for many in her unique poetic voice. Different from other Yiddish poets, Zychlinski did not turn back to, tradition. And many of the Yiddish modernists after World War II returned to tradition and said they had to do so out of loyalty to the victims of the Holocaust and her murdered ancestors and destroyed culture. Zychlinski, who had during the war tried to write in bound form and in rhymes, returned to free verse and left the bound forms behind. She reconnected with her modernist beginnings. And at the same time, when I wrote about her and asked her about this, she also said she did not attend many of the meetings of the Yiddish writers in New York City. I also learned from others that she lived mostly like a very reclusive person, not seeing many others, which might have helped her to be in touch with her earlier forms and not to move to other forms that Yiddish writers used after World War II. She also reconnected to the old images, and she is using them again, but by now these images show that the world they came from are broken. They no longer can, like in the past, converse, for example, with God. He is now frozen among the stars. That's one of the lines. His eyes are now blind. Time is no longer eternal. It is a past that extends into the present. It is simultaneously overshadowing the now and the innocent world in which Zychlinski grew up before the Holocaust. A recurring theme in her early poems is the longing to leave the narrow confines of her home, much as the beggars and vagabonds whom she described passing through the shtetl on their way to other places. But this longing was rooted in a deep sense of belonging, of being at home. something that is nowhere found in her later poems. Rajzel's traumatic experiences manifested themselves in anxiety and sleeplessness, in nightmares, and a general sense of fear and notions of being threatened by others. They might even steal from her. It also made her susceptible to the pain of others, which she turned into beautiful poetry. The homeless man she overhears talking to a trash can on Broadway is lost, and so is the crazy woman who shrieks and quarrels with the grass in the green city squares. Next to these poetic encounters with desolate wanderers and with sleepless survivors and the eternally deported, there are moments of rest and of communion with strangers. And I'd like to read one more poem. Let me see. Nope. Let me go back to this. One of the New York poems is called Small Autumn Squares. Small autumn squares in New York, sleeping monuments on high pedestals amid falling leaves. Lonely men on benches with long outstretched legs seeking God. Staring looks into themselves, around themselves, and pigeons with yellow eyes on the fading grass. Oh, small autumn squares in New York, forgotten by a freezing God among the stars. Her fractured world and self could not become whole again, but in her poetry, Zychlinski could express the pain, and she reassured the beauty of a world that she had observed and captured in vivid images and words. The poet died in 2001 at the age of 90 in Berkeley, California, where she had lived close to her son Marek during the last years of her life. I want to close this reading and talk with a poem, Sis Gewein. Was there ever such a day? And I will read it first in English and then the Yiddish that you see here, so that the Yiddish will stay with you, I hope, as good as I can make it Yiddish. Was there ever such a day? Was there ever such a day? Mother was sitting on the green grass knitting a stocking. Birds were flying over our humble roof. The water was waiting in the pitcher, cold, green. In the garden of our neighbor, the apples were ripening. In the window, a bee was buzzing and buzzing. Oh, where is the cloud on which I was riding, swinging with my joyful niece? Es ist gewesen. Ist Tacke gewesen, als a Sommertag in mein Leben? Ja, es ist gewesen. Die Mama ist gesessen auf dem grünen Gras, in a Bleukleid und gestrickt a Sock. Täuben haben geflattert auf unserem niedrigen Dach. Das Wasser hat gewahrt in erdenem Krug, kalt und grün. Beim Bruxen Schochen haben gezeitigt die Äppel in Sod. Beim Fenster hat gejummet, gejummet, a goldene Bien. Oh, wo ist der Wolken, auf welchen ich bin gesessen und gefachet mit meine freiliche Knie. And here she is looking at you again. And as you can see, she was into her old age a very beautiful poet. Thank you. Scott, I think you need to unmute at least yourself first.
I was trying to, thank you. So let's do this. We have some questions that have come in the chat. You have two options. You can either send me a chat with a message, which at least one person has done, or raise your hand. And if that doesn't work, we'll try to find some alternatives rather than unmuting all the lines, okay? So either, and just to take you through this for those who aren't familiar with Zoom, in the middle of the row below the screen, if you put your cursor there, you'll see various options in this chat, and you can use that to send me a message. Or if you like, to the right, where you see reactions with a smiley face and a plus, you can use that, click on that to raise your hand, and I'll try to acknowledge you as well. Okay?
And I
So,
want to add just one thing. I didn't have my chat open. So the first post that I see starts at 2:43. I cannot read your question.
it's okay. I'll read the questions. Okay. But I'll read, but you know, I think it'd be nice if people want to ask the questions directly. I just want to make sure that the traffic is not overwhelming. Okay, so a question from Bernie Geyer for Karina. Do we know if Polish or non-Jewish people read Rajzel's poetry?
Yes, I know about 2 anthologies in Polish. By now it might be more. I haven't followed that, I have to say that. But she was read in Poland when they were translated into the Polish language. But her publications themselves were always in Yiddish, and her readership was mostly Yiddish.
Excellent. I have a question or a comment, which is I thought it was striking that although Rajzel had 5 sisters in the United States, in her memoir, she never noted that. These are sisters who, my great aunts, who went over to the United States with her father on these 3 trips to the United States. Do you have any reason why, at least at that point in her life, she didn't mention these sisters? Because when she came to the United States, because of various circumstances as a new immigrant with a new family, she became dependent on those sisters.
Yeah, and this is so interesting. Scott, I'm so glad that you mentioned this. These are the sisters from the first marriage, while Rajzel is from a second marriage. And I didn't know about these sisters. When I was writing my dissertation, she never mentioned them. And I do think that this is part of how, I've seen this more often later. I didn't understand it at that time, but people who have very traumatic experiences can do very harsh breaks. Something that is painful would be cut out of the life. And I think that is part of this, that when they had once an argument, that Rajzel would cut this out completely. She was also, and that is very important, I should have mentioned that actually first. Rajzel was a very, not only reclusive person, but also very protective of her personal and her private life. And when I asked questions, she would often not answer. It was definitely her who was driving the dialogue and what I knew and what I didn't know. And if she didn't want me to know about this part of her life, she wouldn't say that. Marek much later, mentioned that she had sisters. But then my book was published and I thought, okay, she did not want me this to know, so I will respect it. But now we have moved on, and I'm so glad that this is also part of reconnecting this family.
Yeah. Actually, Mordke Wolf, her father, actually had two wives. Um, her mother, Devorah, was actually the mother of two of those sisters. So the first three sisters came to the United States with their father, and when her mother objected, the rabbi in town said, no, you don't have a choice. And then he came back for the second sisters with the same answer. So two of those sisters, one of whom was my grandfather, was actually a daughter of her mother and her biological full sister. But those sisters were born before she was born. There was quite an age spread, so she did not know them in Gombin. Okay, there's a question from Anita Greenbaum, which is, did Rajzel ever associate with other Gombiners when she came to the US?
I have to say the same. I assume so. I did read when I was writing my dissertation, the Zichron book of Gombin, and I asked her about it. She was going back to this. She mentioned people. She was definitely interested who survived, but she didn't talk about this. And Rajzel really tried to keep me for herself, but not connect me to other people. It was only much later that, I came in touch with her through Marek because I was able to locate Marek. When I set out writing my dissertation, I didn't know if she was still alive, where she lived, how to get in touch with her. And Marek I could locate because he was, this is before the internet, believe it or not. The internet is evolving, but it was not Google. So I was mostly on the phone. I located a translator of hers who knew her, who got me in touch with Marek. Marek sent a letter of me to her, and then she decided she would write to me. That's how it went. And it was not what we do today, where I would just Google and say, did you know in Gombin this person? Did you see the film? It was all by letter. Rajzel and I, we never spoke on the phone. She didn't like that. So I would write a letter, and 2 weeks later, I would get a letter by her.
Excellent. Harold, you had a question. Did you want to speak? Your microphone is unmuted.
It's unmuted, right?
Yeah, you're fine.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I found it interesting that Rajzel was able to survive the war by fleeing toward Russia, because that's exactly what my parents did some scant weeks before the Germans invaded. And they managed to survive the war years in Russia, and after the war returned to Gombin and picked up the survivors and went on to a camp in Germany. I was wondering if you could fill in a little bit more detail as to where Rajzel was after she fled into Russia. I didn't quite get it all.
Yeah, Rajzel, the plan was first to go to Kolomea because her husband's parents are from Kolomea. And before the outbreak of World War II, which you all know, was the Germans moved from the West, but from the East, the Soviet Union, the Soviet soldiers were also marching into what was Poland. Kolomea had been Polish, and the Jewish population there was still there. So they thought they could be in the Soviet part, but which felt like home. She had been there before. She had met Isaac's parents. But with the Germans moving further eastward, they had to flee further east. And that is when she moved towards Kazan, where they stayed until almost the end of the war. And when the Germans were retreating, she went to Sevastopol, which is at the Black Sea. And that's where she was when the war ended. Like all the Jewish refugees, they had to wait much longer to return to Poland than the Polish refugees. You might know about this, that Poland did not permit first the Jewish refugees to return. So that is how she returned a year later than the Polish compatriots she also knew. And then she was for 2 years again in Lodz, and she also went to Gombin. She had known about the Holocaust and the murder because the Yiddish newspapers in the Soviet Union had published the news. They had eyewitnesses, they had people who had escaped. Somehow she told me she still couldn't believe it until she had seen with her own eyes that nothing was left.
Bernie, you had a question? Oh, you have to unmute, Bernie.
I wanted to make a comment about Anita's question. So very early on in my own involvement in the Gombin Society, I contacted YIVO about their archives on Gombin. And one of the things that emerged from that was a set of photographs from the early Nazi period. They were Jewish photographs clearly, but they had the Nazi stamp on them, the swastika stamp on them. So they must have been from some sort of official document. But they came from the apartment of Jacob Tselemensky. Is that a name that came up, Karina, in your research?
It rings familiar to me, but I have to admit that I do not recall that I wrote about him.
Okay, so I can make just
Must
one
have
brief
heard
comment.
the name.
He published a autobiography of his experiences in the war. He was a youngster in the war, and he spent his time, and he was very fluent in Polish and looked, could pass as an Aryan, and he spent his time carrying money for the Joint Distribution Committee between ghettos. But he was from Gombin, and I think he ended up, this book I think is published in Australia, that I have a copy of it at home in Baltimore. But he's an interesting character. He lived a long life, and he definitely had some connection to Rajzel, but I don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Anita, I think you had a question.
It wasn't a question, it was a comment. It's certainly a name I know. I think I'll have to look it up in old address books, but I think in my family, my father's address books, that's a name I'm familiar with seeing. So I'll have to get back to everyone on that.
Excellent.
Arthur is there.
Arthur, let me unmute your mic, Arthur, if you can.
Okay. Terrific talk. Love to hear it. Two or three things. One, where did the Rajzel live in New York? And when did she go to City College? Maybe we overlapped.
Okay. City College, I need to look up. And it was, I should know this.
Probably in the 50s, right?
In the 50s, yes. But I think she mentioned the years in her. I have this letter in front of me. And if not, I will send you the dates, and Scott can also share this with the fellow Gombiners.
There was, New York was such a rich literary community.
Yeah, and she lived on the Upper West Side, where she frequented also for a while the cafe where Singer was.
So this was, what does it say, north of 72nd Street, along Broadway and Amsterdam.
No address. Rajzel would not give me this. She said, I lived there, and then I moved to Brighton Beach, and that had to do with the separation from her husband. I also asked her about the Bronx, where she must have lived, and she wrote a poem. That's why I knew about it, and it is it's called In the Suburbs. So for a while they must have lived in a house in the Bronx, but I could not elicit any answer there. She said, no, now I'm here, that's enough. Everything is in my poems. That was really the standard sentence. If she didn't want to answer, everything's in my poems. You just need to read the poems. That's all you need to know.
And I think you mentioned that you were working on a biography.
I'm working on a biography of Dorothy Thompson, this time in German.
Yes. But what about Rajzel? Is there any, has anyone,
I would not attempt that because I don't know enough.
yes.
I mean, we would, if someone wants to do this, there's now much more to find. There's also Marek, Scott can contribute from his family side. I mean, this would be certainly worth now doing this.
Has he written anything about the family, Marek?
Marek has edited, and I have that here in front of me, has edited this book. This is the problem with the...
I have that one. Yeah.
So can we do this? Yes, it works. God hid his face. And he was the editor of the book, but the preface is, let me see, by...
Word and Quill, I have it. I have the same book.
Yes, that helps. Yeah, it's the virtual background that swallows it. No, and it's Emmanuel Goldsmith, who is was professor of Yiddish language and literature at Queen's College. So Marek didn't write about her.
Might be wonderful to have your notes or comments. Might be interesting to do an article on it, even for you.
I mean, one article that is easily accessible is in the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women.
Mm-hmm.
And I can send the link simply to Scott so he can share it with all of you. And that's also where I have all the book titles listed. That's what
Good.
I compiled. And I updated it when one new book came out.
Terrific. Love the talk. Thank you a lot.
There's
Thank you, Arthur.
There was a question that was circulating between Francine and Harold about whether she might have been a member of the New York Gombin Society and have known an Uncle Raymond. There's a comment that Harold made that the society in New York and New Jersey often had joint meetings, but it's not clear if they overlapped and if she attended. Do you know anything about that, Karina?
She never mentioned any of this. And if she didn't, doesn't mean that she didn't participate. It just meant that she didn't want me to meet other people. It was very solitary, our meetings. Yeah.
Irene, you had a question. Why don't you unmute yourself?
Palestinian.
Yeah, oh,
Hit the unmute button, Irene. It's in the lower left, but you're going to have to do that.
okay, got it?
Good, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. My parents were very active in the Gombiner Society in New York for years. And I noticed that in her name, in the poet's name, there were almost an affinity for Zychlin, Zichlin, who were also very active in the Gombiner Society. So if they did not mention her, or she came to any note during the meetings or the affairs or whatever, so she did not participate, but I cannot tell you my feel. I can't even.
Yeah, I have been at the SICO when it was still in the Flatiron building. And I met the people there, and they also told me, and I should have mentioned this. So 2 things that I didn't mention is, for a while, Rajzel also lived in Canada.
Yes.
And I know that she had relationships to the community. She didn't want to give me any names. And when I went to the SICO and to the YIVO, and Sheva Sukkah also, who knew Rajzel, all of them knew that she's not seeing people. So I had no idea. When she invited me to come and speak to her, I thought it's just normal business. I meet a poet. I mean, it's never normal that you meet poets, but it is what people do. When I went back to the YIVO and talked to the people there, they said, what, she's meeting you, she's refusing to see anybody. And it might have to do with the fact that she could control very much. If she would see me, I came from very far away, Germany. And she also told me once that she wanted young Germans that they read her poetry and read about the Holocaust so that they would remember and that this would never happen again.
Irene, you had a follow-up comment or question that you
Yes.
wanted to ask Nick?
My family's name in Gombin was Brzezinski, but in
I can't hear you.
listening to the lady and other stories about the very talented people that we have lost, through the Holocaust, generations of brains. I mean, you can see it in Israel, the talent. I mean, we saw through your auspices, through the gentleman's auspices, a trip through the sculptures in Tel Aviv, the art, the writers. I mean, we've lost so many people just because they were Jews for no other reason. And for that, I mean, humanity, I cannot say enough. That bothers me more than anything else.
Yeah.
Irene, one other additional bit of information, that when the Zychlinski family came to the United States and they lived in New York and Chicago, they changed their name to Zyklin.
Yes,
Rajzel
and
never made that change. And there were other Zychlinskis besides her family. We were able to, through Michael's help, I found at least 2 other Zychlinski families. So, and I'm not sure what their whereabouts are as well. But Rajzel's sisters and their children changed their names to Zyklin.
That's why I never found them.
thank you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Irene?
yeah, and one of the Zyklins gave enough money to City College to name the School of Economics after him. The Zyklins produced quite a noted family.
See, I learned much.
And there were the Krauts too. Kraut. Did you know any of the Krauts from Gombin?
No.
Okay. Bernie has one other question. Go ahead, Bernie.
I wanted to just tell everyone that someone asked about an article, Karina's article in a magazine called Prism from Yeshiva University is on our website. We have a link to it because in the section on family histories, we have a very short bio sketch of Rajzel Zychlinski, and it's linked to your article. And we will now post this recording of your presentation to that as well. So we'll have more material on Rajzel, but I encourage any of you to pursue these genealogical connections and family connections. We always learn a lot whenever they come up. I want to thank Rajzel personally for being willing to give this talk again and to.
I'm not Rajzel, Bernie.
I'm sorry. You are to us.
I wish.
Karina, thank you so much for bringing her to life. Well, you've brought her to life for us because none of us knew her, and to hear her poetry read in Yiddish and in English, it's just marvelous for us. So thank you so much for your willingness to do this, and I encourage any of you who are on the call now to, if we don't have your email address and you're not, you haven't looked at the website, to do so and reconnect with friends and relatives and Landsleute, as they say in Yiddish.
And if I may something, Arthur's idea about a biography, I mean, you are here, you have memories, or you know people who left memories. I think it's time to do this in English.
Did she know Isaac Bashevis Singer?
Yes, they met in a cafe. That's what she told me. There was a literati cafe on the Upper West Side, and she also went there.
Yes, 74th or 75th Street.
Excellent. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to thank everyone. I wanted to have Bernie make some final comments. I believe he did. And I'm going to end the call. And thank you for joining. And this session has been recorded. And we will give you some more information about how you can access that in the future. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.